I am very excited to be introducing Elaine Weiss tonight. Elaine is an award-winning journalist and writer. Her magazine feature writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, New York Times, Boston Globe, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as reports and documentaries for National Public Radio and Voices of America. She's the author of one previous book, Fruits of Victory, The Woman's Land Army in the Great War, on a World War II-era women's movement to take up the farm work of the men serving as soldiers in Europe. Also in her bio, which I love, it says she votes in every election. She's here tonight to discuss her new book, The Women's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. It's a spirited, dare I say, page-turning account of the battle in Tennessee over whether to become the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment and give women officially the right to vote. Publishers Weekly called the book remarkably entertaining and a timely examination of a shining moment in the ongoing fight to achieve a more perfect union. Please join me in welcoming Elaine Weiss.
Thank you so much. It's really, I am so delighted to be here. This is a special bookstore and an anchor of the city, which really needs an anchor like this. And so I'm really feel privileged to be here. And it's very fitting because this book is a book of prose about politics. So, and it's a great, rollicking, bare-knuckled political tale, which I think the city can appreciate, with women as the lead protagonists. You don't get that too often. It's a book about political power and political will, about racial and gender politics, about states' rights, about the vote, and about democracy and our conflicted views about that. You might say that the suffrage movement was the original Me Too movement because it was an uprising of women bravely standing up and speaking out about how they'd been treated or mistreated and demanding change. Many of the scenes in the book actually take place here in D.C., though the story is centered in Tennessee. It takes place in the White House, where there's an incapacitated president, Woodrow Wilson, and his wife is pretty much running the government, and she is an anti-suffragist. In the Congress, it takes place in the streets here, and even in the jails of the district. It's a story of how American women's demand for the vote, which was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, was slowly and methodically, and at great cost, transformed into something that was eventually considered inevitable. The fight for women's suffrage is really one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. And it's one that cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who gets to participate in our government? Who has a voice? When we say we the people, do we really mean everyone? And we're still asking those questions today. The Women's Hour chronicles the explosive climax of that struggle during one very hot summer in 1920 in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was initially drawn to write about this intensely dramatic fight over the 19th Amendment because it had such a great front story. It was so filled with vivid, complex characters and lots of twisty plot turns. But I quickly realized that contained within this immediate story was really the whole panorama of the women's suffrage movement, the personalities, the ideas, the conflicts. And that story had never really been told in a popular narrative fashion before. It really is, as some reviewers have called it, a political thriller with strong women in the starring roles. And you'll get to know them as people, as women, as savvy politicians, not just historical footnotes. And there is a large cast of very colorful male characters, too, from Woodrow Wilson to Franklin Roosevelt. Even Al Jolson makes a cameo appearance. It's a tale of suspense with double crosses, dubious motives, many betrayals. And if I've done my job, you'll forget that you do know what the outcome is. At least you think you do. If you're like me, and I'm not a suffrage scholar, you've only had a really fuzzy idea of how women won the vote. And that active verb is very important. They won it. It was not given to the women of America. They had to fight for it. And that hazy vision goes something like this. There's some place called Seneca Falls, and back in the horse and buggy days, and everyone's wearing hoop skirts and bonnets, and it's very picturesque. And they make some demands. And then poof, American women hold up some picket signs and they protest, and then they get the vote. I mean, that's sort of the narrative, the very compressed narrative that we have in our minds. And American men gave their wives and mothers and sisters and daughters the vote because they believed in justice. And it was the march of progress, and it happened naturally. And the 20th century dawned, and it was time for this step to be taken. And no, that's not how it happened. Not at all. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working over 7 decades to finally secure the vote for American women. And the culmination of that crusade, which we call the women's suffrage movement, came down to one fierce 6-week battle in Nashville, Tennessee. In the summer of 1920, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, giving all women in every state the right to vote in every election. 35 states had ratified, and 3/4 of the states, or 3/4 of the 48 states then in the Union, so 36 states were required for full ratification. Tennessee could be the 36th. If the Tennessee legislature approved the amendment, women's suffrage would become the law of the land in time for the 1920 presidential election. If the amendment failed in Tennessee, it could be delayed indefinitely and perhaps not be enacted. And we who've lived through the non-enactment of the ERA can begin to understand how that could happen. The enfranchisement of 1/2 of the citizens of the United States was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. By 1920, when the book takes place, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for 72 years, since that first outrageous demand for the vote was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass at that Seneca Falls women's meeting in 1848. And many of those attending the meeting, even the great reformer and activist Lucretia Mott, and I know we have a descendant of Mrs. Mott here tonight, thought that asking for the vote was a terrible idea. It was too radical. If thee demands that, thee will make us ridiculous, Lizzie. We must go slowly, said Lucretia Mott. But Frederick Douglass disagreed. He stood up and he said, no, you must demand the vote. Nothing will come without a demand. And he called himself a women's rights man for all of his life. And he truly was. He is one of the heroes of the book, and he is a champion throughout his life for women's right to vote. In the years since Seneca Falls, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists had waged over 900 state, local, and national campaigns to win the ballot. They'd traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony would call it, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities across the nation. They had to change hearts and minds before they could change the laws. And they were really, truly the original She Persisted, 7 decades. They endured contempt and ridicule in their communities, their churches, and in the press. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. They were attacked by mobs of men and boys. They were denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, even Bolsheviks. They were derided as unattractive, unsexed, she-men, and the men who supported them were belittled as Mabels and Nancys. And in the last years of the movement, the suffragists were physically attacked, arrested, imprisoned, force-fed, and tortured here in Washington for demanding their rights as citizens. In their quest for equal citizenship, the women of the suffrage movement employed a wide variety of stratagems and methods. And many of these, marches, demonstrations, picketing, acts of civil disobedience, sophisticated lobbying and public relations operations, and legal test cases, would be adopted by the civil rights campaigns of the 20th and 21st century. So they really formed a model for those struggles to come. It was a stupendous feat of organization, if you think of it, because we had none of the travel or communication tools that we take for granted today. When the movement began, passenger train travel was really in its infancy and very uncomfortable. The telegraph had only recently been invented. There was no typewriter. There was no telephone. And even in 1920, when my book takes place, radio has not come into use. And as one young woman in my publisher's office exclaimed when she read the manuscript, she said, "I don't understand how they could do this without Facebook." Well, the suffragists were ingenious, and they were also fearless. To test the prohibitions against women voting, Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth and about 150 other women actually voted in the 1872 election. "I have been and gone and done it," Susan gleefully wrote to her collaborator, Elizabeth Stanton, after she had placed her vote in the ballot box. She was soon arrested, put on trial, and convicted of illegal voting. "Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote?" she protested. And that's another question that we can ask today. Failure of this voting experiment led Stanton and Anthony to draft a constitutional amendment, and it was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it was stalled there for 40 years. Every year, the suffragists would go up to Capitol Hill to testify before Congress. And Elizabeth Stanton writes in her memoir that while she was testifying one year, the senator was clipping his nails, he was eating his lunch, he was sharpening his pencils, he was reading the newspaper, and she had to do everything she could to restrain herself from throwing her manuscript at his head. The amendment was voted down in committee or on the floor of the House and Senate 28 times. And frustration over this delay pushed the suffragists to adopt some novel approaches. They marched in the streets. You know, when we're marching in the streets now, we don't think all that much of it, but it was considered very improper for women to do these things. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear their marching uniforms, white dresses with yellow sashes. And the first national women's suffrage parade took place right here in Washington, Pennsylvania Avenue, in March of 1913. It was on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. It was a grand procession of about 5,000 women, floats and bands, women on horseback. That's when Inez Milholland is on horseback. And the men watching were incensed. This was not how women were supposed to behave. And mobs of men closed in on the marchers and grabbed their banners, tore them, threw the women to the ground, ripped their clothes, and stomped on them. Police stood by and just watched the assaults. There was a congressional investigation, but no one was punished. There were more scenes of violence here in D.C. When frustrated suffragists began picketing the White House in 1917 with banners demanding, "Mr. President, what will you do for liberty?" And democracy begins at home, because, of course, we were fighting in the war to make the world safe for democracy, and yet half of our democracy couldn't vote. Hundreds were arrested for picketing, but they were, of course, their First Amendment rights, they should be able to picket, so they were arrested for obstructing the sidewalk. And they were sentenced to up to 6 months in the fetid Occoquan prison in Virginia. They were held in decrepit, vermin-infested cells. They were physically, even sexually assaulted, clubbed, tied to the wall, not allowed to read, write, or even speak to one another. They communicated by singing. And when they refused to eat, they were force-fed. Tubes rammed down their noses. Alice Paul was held in solitary confinement. Doctors threatened to commit her to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. They were trying to break her. They were trying to break her sense of leadership. No one was punished for this abuse. Finally, in 1919, the federal amendment was passed by both houses of Congress and sent off to the states for ratification. And a year later, when my book takes place in the summer of 1920, the amendment was on the cusp of victory or defeat when it arrived in Tennessee. because Tennessee was really a dangerous place to stage this definitive battle for women's suffrage. Nearly all the other southern states had already rejected the amendment with a very racist rationale. They did not want Black women to vote. The suffragists knew they faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. It was their last best hope. So all the forces for and against women's suffrage gathered in Nashville, and the campaign generals arrived in their white gloves and picture hats. The national suffrage leader, Carrie Chapman Catt, came from New York. She was trained by Susan B. Anthony and anointed by Anthony to take over the leadership of the movement. She's a master strategist and politician. Then there's young Sue Shelton White, who returned home to Tennessee to lead the ratification campaign for Alice Paul's Women's Party. And if you've been to the Belmont Paul House on Capitol Hill, you get the story of the Women's Party, which splits off from the mainstream National American Women's Suffrage Association because they are going to take these radical, more aggressive tactics like picketing and civil disobedience. And then there's Josephine Pearson, the leader of the Tennessee anti-suffragists, who promised in a very touching scene, promised her dying mother that she would protect her homeland and fight the scourge of women's suffrage if it ever came to Tennessee. And she arrives to defend her home state from what she calls the feminist peril. They're joined by more than 1,000 men and women from across the state and around the nation, suffs and anti-suffragists, governors and senators, corporate lobbyists, journalists, and nervous legislators, all entering the fray. Because there were powerful forces at work against ratification in Tennessee, political, corporate, and ideological foes, each with their own reasons for opposing the amendment. We don't think about these sort of complications when we think of women's suffrage. There were politicians who feared an unpredictable new voting bloc. They didn't know what women wanted. They also were a little worried about whether they'd be attractive enough as a candidate to women voters. They really did worry about that. Clergymen were against it, for the most part, not completely. But those who believed that women voting went against the will of God, that was their argument, because God had purposefully made Eve to be subservient to Adam. And they used biblical teachings to oppose suffrage for women. And then there's corporations who believed women voters would be bad for business. The textile manufacturers feared that women voters would try to abolish child labor. And they depended on child labor because it was cheap. The liquor industry feared that women voters would insist on strict enforcement of the prohibition laws, which had just been enacted, but they were hoping that they wouldn't be enforced, not very stringently. They worried if women got the vote, they might insist on strict enforcement. So the liquor lobby sponsored a speakeasy, even though prohibition is in effect, on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville, which is right across from the State House, and was known as the Jack Daniels Suite, where legislators were plied with liquor morning, noon, and night, and encouraged to vote against the amendment if they could stand up. There are all kinds of great descriptions of the legislators warbling down the hallways of the hotel at night, singing, "Keep the home fires burning." But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turns out to be women. Anti-suffrage women. That women might oppose the enfranchisement of their sisters really shocked me. And some of these anti-suffragists were sophisticated, well-educated women, like muckraking journalist Ida Tarbell. She was an anti-suffragist. She's actually a vice president of the Anti-Suffrage Association. Quite a few wives of U.S. senators were leaders of the anti-movement. And, this may shock you, Eleanor Roosevelt was not a suffragist. Her husband, FDR, is actually running for the vice presidency in the 1920 election. And he has declared he actually does support the amendment and women's suffrage, but Eleanor does not. So you'll learn about her evolution in the book. Some of the suffrage women argued that women would be sullied by direct contact with politics, and that they would, they talk about women being stuck in the muck of politics, and they would lose the soft power, that soft suasion that they said that women had to influence policy indirectly, sort of like having people in the White House kind of thing. Many were social and religious conservatives who feared that suffrage would bring about a profound, unhealthy shift in gender roles. And again, we see this argument being used in all kinds of other subsequent arguments about gay marriage, all kinds of things that use that same, going to be a shift in gender roles. They thought it would endanger the American home and bring about, and this is their words, the moral collapse of the nation. It would alter, in their minds, private life, not just political life. And this is really an important reminder that the debate over women's suffrage was never just a political debate. It was also a social and cultural, and for some people, a moral debate about women's role in society. And it's a precursor to what we now call the culture wars. It was a very complex, emotional debate. So all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There's bribes and booze, propaganda, blackmail, conspiracies, kidnappings, and fistfights, betrayal and courage. And the newspapers call it suffrage Armageddon. The outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. I won't spoil it for you. But it does come down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. All this took place almost a century ago. But you'll find, I think, that The Woman's Hour is a book of history with surprising, perhaps even unnerving modern themes. It helps explain where we've been and where we are today. It deals with topics that dominate our headlines right now: voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, and the role of religion in public policy, and racism. Because the history of suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there were cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is waved in defiance. And we've certainly been hearing echoes of all that recently. And did I mention, the story unfolds in the midst of a bitter presidential election of 1920, where the campaign slogan for the Republican candidate, who is a notorious womanizer, who is being blackmailed by one of his mistresses and has paid hush money to keep her silent. True. Is America First. Warren G. Harding. Yep. I submitted the manuscript for this book on the day before Election Day, 2016. I pushed the send button. That's how you send manuscripts these days. You don't deliver the paper. You push the send button. And it flew through the ether to the desk of my editor, the inbox of my editor. And she wrote back, "Hurrah, great timing." Well, it was more timely than we could have known. By the next evening, of course, the national landscape had changed. And in the month since, the national psyche has changed. And this story that I wrote of the suffragists' long fight for democracy and the final battle in Nashville has taken on layers of meaning that I could not have anticipated. This story of ordinary women, grassroots activists, taking to the streets and demanding change assumes new resonance when millions of women and men march to protest government policies today. And this tale of women standing up and demanding their voices be heard and their complaints be taken seriously echoes loudly as women rise up to insist Me Too And time's up. And the history of citizens fighting for their rights enters a really new dimension as rights they assumed were secure, voting rights, citizenship rights, press freedom, women's rights, appear to be endangered again. On Election Day 2016, having handed in my manuscript, I actually was out knocking on doors. And I did learn a lesson about the powerful legacy of these suffragists that I had just written a book about. Because while I was out in the field, thousands of women were casting their vote on the day, you might remember, that a woman was running for the presidency. And then they were making pilgrimages to the graves of the suffragists who had won that vote for them. So they placed flowers and thank you notes and their I voted stickers on the graves of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt in New York City, where they're buried. Alice Paul is buried in New Jersey, and they went there. And in Rochester, where Susan B. Anthony is buried, more than 10,000 men and women visited her grave that day. And it was just spilling over with tributes to her. There were important lessons to be learned, I think, from the fight for women's suffrage, which I tell the story of in the book. And those lessons are that social change is slow and political change is hard. And the struggle to expand our democracy is still ongoing. Reform movements are imperfect. The story of women's suffrage is both an inspiring and a cautionary tale. There are moral compromises made by the suffragists to win. They leave their Black sisters behind. And I hope the story of the Woman's Hour will teach a new generation of activists, some of whom are coming to Washington this coming weekend, that protest is patriotic and necessary, but it must be followed by well-designed and sustained political strategies. The suffragists did not just march and picket and protest. They also organized, debated, lobbied, and campaigned. The vote is a prayer, as Carrie Catt described it. The vote is power. And today, our job is to protect that vote for all citizens. And it's our sacred duty to use that vote, some of us won it from these women, to improve and expand our democracy. And that's what the suffragists can teach us. And I hope you'll enjoy reading about them. Questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. Could you say a little bit about how the two major parties broke down in support of this, and specifically in the Tennessee legislature? I'm assuming Tennessee was a democratically controlled.
Yes, that's part of the complexity. That's a great question. You have to sort of switch your gears a little bit when you're talking in 1920. So the Republican Party actually has the better record on women's suffrage, going back for decades. And they are trying to get this through because they hope it'll help their presidential candidate. Unfortunately, their presidential candidate waffles back and forth, and you'll see how he does that. In Tennessee, it's really interesting because it is a predominantly Democratic state. But the East Tennessee, there's three divisions, as they call the grand divisions of Tennessee: Middle, West, and East. East Tennessee actually was sympathetic to the Union during the Civil War. It did not want to secede. They tried to stay in the Union. And so they have a very different political ecosystem there, and that is a Republican area. So 2/3 of the legislature was Democrats, and 1/3 was Republicans. Democrats in the South tended to not support women's suffrage because it would allow Black women to vote. And it was blatant. That was it. And the Republicans were a little more sympathetic and were willing to support it. And so most of the Republicans do end up supporting it. And the Democrats split. And it really almost fails. It almost fails. It's one vote.
A related question.
Yes.
Can you review a little bit how things seem to be centered on the Hermitage in Nashville.
Now, let me just ask, the Hermitage as Andrew Jackson's homestead, or the Hermitage Hotel named after it? The hotel, yes. So the Hermitage Hotel is a grand hotel. It was actually built in 1910 by the citizens of Nashville, the businessmen. They said, we need a first-class hotel. So it's this very beautiful hotel. I was just there last week. And it is just 2 blocks from the State House. So it's really the nerve center for all the legislators. And what's so interesting for me in telling a story is that all those 3 women who lead the different factions of the fight. So you have Carrie Catt coming from New York. She's the mainstream suffrage leader, 2 million members of her organization. You have the young 3rd generation suffragist who is impatient and wants things to happen fast. And then you have the anti-suffragist, Josephine Pearson, who is also staying there. So the headquarters of the suffrage movement and the headquarters of the anti-suffrage movement were both in the Hotel Hermitage. And there's this wonderful photograph, which is in the book, of the anti-suffrage headquarters. And it's a picture of Josephine Pearson with another anti-suffrage leader. And one is holding the Confederate battle flag, and one the American flag. And between them is a very old Civil War veteran with a banner for Nathan Bedford Forrest. An infamous, he was a general in the Tennessee Confederate Army, but he is also one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. So this was a very symbolic photograph that they staged and distributed, so they knew exactly what they were doing. But they called the Hermitage Hotel the 3rd house of the legislature, because so much was going on there. And then, of course, the legislators are getting drunk up on the 8th floor. So it's just a wild scene. I mean, it's almost Marx Brothers like, they're coming in, they're listening through the transoms. There's all kinds of spying going on. It's deadly hot. It's Nashville in July and August, and there's no air conditioning, of course. And so the suffragists have to decide whether they're going to keep their transoms open and allow the spies for the anti-suffragists to hear what they're talking about, or they're going to sweat and close the transoms. So it's very much a part of that story. Yes.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for making us aware of how much this is something we take for granted, but shouldn't be.
Yes.
And how close it really was. And also for us boomers, regretful that our generation could not be as successful with the ERA. But what really intrigues me was something you said at the beginning about Mrs. Wilson and the glaring incongruity of her running the country while opposing women's suffrage. And, I know that Wilson was a Democrat and he was a Southerner, but, I'm not that familiar with what she was like. Was she in the forefront? Was she one of the Phyllis Schlaflys of her day? And where was Woodrow on all this?
Well, that's a big part of the book, actually. Woodrow's also his wife this is his second wife. His first wife actually dies while he's in office in his first term. And he marries a Washington, D.C. widow who zips around town in her electric car. Yeah. I mean, she was really ahead of her time in that. But she's very beautiful. She's very self-possessed. And she hates the idea of women being able to vote. Woodrow Wilson, very slowly evolves, as we say, changes his mind about this. He's against it for almost all of his career. When he's governor, when he's president of Princeton, he's against it. When he is the governor of New Jersey, he's against it. When he's his first term of presidency, the reason he kind of comes around is because he realizes he needs women if his League of Nations has any chance. Senate has already rejected it, and he's hoping that if women could vote in 1920, they might bring in people who would want the sense of a peaceful assembly of the nations. And so that's part of his reason. But he does, in the end, really support, and he's writing telegrams to Tennessee. But they have to go around his wife, who is running the government, because he's much more incapacitated than anyone knows. And I actually was able to look at some of his doctor's notes at that time, and he's having nightmares and hallucinations and things like that. So his wife is kind of keeping it going. Even his cabinet doesn't know how sick he is. So the incongruity, you're absolutely right, of her running the government yet not wanting women to vote. But when on election day 1920, she does very proudly vote and says that she's very glad that her husband supported women's suffrage. So she takes credit for it too.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yes, sir.
Could you, since the suffragists won ultimately, and the ERA lost, sadly, I would imagine as you're writing this, you thought about all that. And could you say something about why one group won and the other group lost?
Well, it's very interesting because the women you'll read about in the Women's Hour, the National Women's Party, the Alice Paul women, say once they win the vote, that's just the first step. And now we have to have equality in all other aspects, economic, educational, all these things. And so Sue White is actually one of the women who drafts the ERA, and it's submitted to Congress in 1923, just 3 years after women get the vote. However, it's really controversial. And many suffragists, including Carrie Catt, including Eleanor Roosevelt, who, once the vote is won, joins the League of Women Voters, becomes a protege of Carrie Catt, who teaches her the political ropes. So it's really interesting, and they remain friends for the rest of their lives. And Sue White works with Eleanor Roosevelt to get women into the Democratic Party. But the ERA splits what was the suffragists because, and labor. It really was not such a simple idea because it would have nullified certain protective legislation for women, protecting them in industry. Wouldn't have to lift certain weights above, a certain threshold. And this would have gotten rid of those. And so those who had fought for labor rights were against it. So it really was not all the suffragists supported it. It was not a unified goal. So it is interesting. But of course, it did occur to me that, Alice Paul worked for that for the next 50 years. And it didn't get. So if the amendment had not been ratified at this point, I'm not going to say it would never have been ratified, but I think it would have been delayed significantly. And the reason the suffragists saw this as their last stand, it was because no other state was willing to consider it. About 10 states had already rejected it. And they saw the pendulum swinging to a more reactionary American mood. We're coming out of an unpopular war, and people don't want foreign entanglements. They're worried about immigration. Does this sound familiar? They're worried about automation and losing jobs. So there's a lot going on in the nation that makes the suffragists feel if they don't get it now, it's not going to happen. And they're very, very nervous about that.
Because by 1924, the KKK was really strong again.
You bet. And again, the racial politics is very, very strong in the book. And that was a surprise to me. I didn't think that women's suffrage was going to have so much to do with the racial parts. Yes.
You mentioned Ida Tarbell being anti-suffrage, which really threw me. Do you have any information as how she rationalized that?
Well, the suffragists couldn't figure it out. They, Jane Addams, the famous reformer, famously said, "There's something wrong with Ida Tarbell's mind." It was very contradictory, and I read a lot about it to try to understand this a little more myself. It's not basically she writes treatises on this. I mean, she says women should not even try to take jobs that men have. They should stay at home. Now, here's this woman who's just taken down Rockefeller and the trusts, and she's the highest paid journalist in America, and she's saying no. If you know what's good for you, stay home. So there's probably some emotional thing going on there. I don't know, but she has stumped. I've read scholars who've tried to figure this out, and it's not easy. It's not easy, but yeah, it's kind of amazing. Let's see, we hear it, and we'll come here.
You touch on two key parts of this battle, which is one, women being some of the most passionate anti-suffragists and sort of the dynamic that creates, and then also the bravery required on the part of women who were out in the streets, both because they were being arrested, like you were saying, facing all sorts of consequences. I'm wondering if your research you came across any people or events or areas where those two things overlapped, where maybe women personally felt like they wanted to join the fight, but for other reasons, whether it was, they're dependent on husbands, they can't necessarily go out and get a job and support themselves. So that causes them to, I guess, maintain the appearances of being anti-suffrage. I'm curious if you encountered any of those.
Yes. There are certain men who work for the brewing interests, for instance, in St. Louis. The men were warned by the brewery owners and the distillers and the bar owners that if they allowed their wives to march in a suffrage march, they were going to lose their jobs. So you get that, you see how that can happen. You'll also find in the book there's a really fascinating contradiction. Two of the great suffrage leaders in the South, and at the national level, they hold national positions. Laura Clay, who's the daughter of Cassius Clay, who was an abolitionist in Kentucky, and another suffragist from New Orleans, and they have been suffragists for 45 years. They've been fighting this. They come to Tennessee to work against the amendment. And the women face each other. They're all staying in the Hermitage Hotel, and they face each other, and they're in the elevator, and they don't talk to each other. They've been colleagues for 40 years. And the reason is, for these Southern women, they didn't want a federal amendment. It was okay if the states allowed them. They didn't want a federal amendment because that was the Reconstruction all over again. And again, that argument of not having federal eyes, Washington's eyes, who you can allow in the ballot box, will be recreated in the civil rights era in the 1950s and 60s. And it's still being used. So you see women who are conflicted on some other level, but the idea of these really suffrage leaders coming and working against suffrage in the final is really quite heartbreaking. Sure, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi. So oftentimes these days we see that bills rarely are dealing with one thing specific, like it's not women should vote or not. Sometimes there are things that complicate it more often. Yeah. So I'm wondering, were there any complications that made the vote a little bit harder?
Oh, in Tennessee? Or yes, lots. Yeah. It's all about those complications. So one of them is states' rights. One of them is, I support in general women voting, but I don't want a federal amendment. I don't want Washington making these rules for me. Because there are two ways that suffrage can be accorded in America. You can have elections are run by the states. That's why we have state laws. That's why we have state violations of voting rights. So it can be done by the states. And in some places it was. Places like Wyoming, the legislature gave its women the vote. In New York, they just celebrated the 100th anniversary of a referendum where, of course, only men could vote to decide whether women deserved the vote. So there were two ways to do it, and they tried it every which way. I mean, there were many, many failed referendums. But in Tennessee, they're saying well, we might like it, but we don't want a federal amendment because we would abrogate our states' rights. There's also all kinds of other complicating racial. Basically, it's, will this allowing Black women to vote? Black men had already been disenfranchised, even though legally they had the vote. They, poll taxes, literacy, physical intimidation had kept them from voting, and they just didn't want to have to deal with Black women. Yeah, it gets very, very ugly. And in the afterward, I talk about what happens on Election Day of 1920 and the fact that Black women are turned away and assaulted. Well, my understanding is that it was a group of, in fact, in Tennessee, it was a group of Confederate veterans who decided they were going to defend the South's honor. That was sort of the originating principle or idea. And it waxed and waned over the years, and it would get more ferocious, and then it would die back down. But yes, there's a pretty good idea of how it got started. But of course, it starts like almost like a wildfire. It starts in different places and in different states, so it catches fire that way. But in every place, the animating principle was basically, to defend the honor of the South and to make sure that the advances that were made in racial equality were trounced. It was just incredibly ugly. And again, as someone said, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan comes back and is very, very strong. Yeah. Yes.
I want to elaborate on the question a little bit more.
Sure, please.
So I was thinking also when different bills are written, sometimes they add random things like you can vote for this.
Oh, yes, yes.
Include this bridge and this goes to nowhere. So
right.
I'm wondering if there was some of that in this.
No, because the amendment it's just one sentence.
It's just one sentence.
It is just one sentence that the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by any state because on account of sex. That's it. It is just based on the 15th Amendment, which was on account of race and previous servitude. So that's it. They couldn't amend that. They couldn't mess with that.
Well, you've talked about all the arguments against it, which has got me really scared. But there must have been arguments for it. And for instance, there were some expectations, I think, that probably weren't borne out, that women would be more in favor of peace. And
Yes.
So could you talk about
Absolutely. It's very interesting that Carrie Catt, who I find a very fascinating character, very complex, very much a politician, and she believes, she's a pacifist, and she actually, for the sake of suffrage, forsakes her pacifistic beliefs and supports World War I because she thinks women should do this. They should prove their patriotism. But she also believes that women will bring about universal peace. This is one of her dreams. She says this is the evolution of humankind. And if women would not allow this kind of slaughter, they're the mothers, they're not going to allow this. And she's very disappointed when the women of America, when they do vote in 1920, and we know about disappointment, voted for Horace Harding. Horace Harding, my New York. for Warren G. Harding, the New Yorker there, Warren G. Harding, and he was against the League of Nations. So yes, and the other thing is whether women would vote as a bloc. So one of the things the suffragists did was they threatened congressmen, senators, and then the legislators in Tennessee and said, look, if you go against us, if we get the vote, we're going to trounce you at the polls. And we're going to vote as a woman's bloc and vote for women's issues. And we're going to remember who our friends were. And they don't vote as a bloc. They never vote as a bloc. And that dilutes their power. So that, in fact, one of the fascinating things I found in spinning forward what happens afterwards is the suffragists dissolve as a group. They won. Alice Paul and her group continues changing laws on the state level and also the ERA. But it's the anti-suffragists who get stronger. They actually organize themselves and they say, okay, now we have the vote. Now we're going to make sure we're going to stop the kind of socialist, as they call it, socialist legislation, like maternal health bills and all kinds of things that they consider big government. And that maternal line, and they train the next generation, and they also become rabid anti-communists. And you see, and they accuse Carrie Catt and the former suffragists of being communists. That happens in the 1920s. And then you see them entering the McCarthy era. Yeah, there's a really strong line. And then Phyllis Schlafly comes out of that. And we can move it forward as far as we want to. But there is that sense that the anti-suffragists cut their teeth in the suffrage fight, in the ratification fight, and they learned to organize, and they learned what their power could be, and they used it. So it's kind of interesting.
So what do you think were the strongest arguments in favor of the amendment that ultimately narrowly prevailed in Tennessee?
Justice. I mean, there really were some men who said, this is simple justice. We are all citizens. How can we deny women the vote? So I think that was the strongest. There were other more parochial ones, like they'll vote for us. But no, justice was the one shining banner that they could use, and many of the men did believe it. There are some heroes. Thanks. Yes.
Hi. I think what you discussed about the parallels in the book about what women in the 1920s went through and how it parallels to today, and the moral compromise that had to be made about not including Black women in the vote, sort of speaks to the way that people look at women's suffrage in general. They see it as like a white win. Mm-hmm. And I wonder in how you examined looking at Black voters being turned away, how that speaks to what we see today. Because right now, as we see these movements happening, a lot of Black people are involved in activism, but they are distrustful of combining themselves with white women as it speaks to these movements going forward. And I think it comes directly from that. So did you see any reconciliation post the win that they tried to sort of reconcile the fact that they gave up that moral compromise to win? And how does that speak to the ways in which we can potentially compromise today?
That's an excellent question. And I don't want to paint it that they always made that compromise. I think if they could, and having read a lot of their writings, there are some blatantly racist suffragists, no doubt about it. But people like Carrie Catt, somewhat Alice Paul, are, and certainly Susan B. Anthony, truly wanted all women to have the vote. They truly did. For political expediency, they were trying to convince those Southern delegates, look, if you let women vote, there are more white women than Black women. So it's not going to mess your white supremacy. I mean, that was their argument. It was not, that was the gist of the argument. It wasn't Black women shouldn't vote. So that was the moral compromise. There's this actually really heartening partnership in Tennessee between the suffragists and one of the Black women leaders of suffrage in Nashville. And they worked together on legislation in the 1920s. So that's actually that hopeful. And in the North, it was a different question. That the suppression of Black women voting was not strong there. So I don't want to make it seem like every suffragist threw, her Black sister behind. That's not how it happened. But they did make these compromises, and it hurt to write about it. I think that the distrust continued, of course, in the labor movement, in the peace movement, the anti-war movement in the 60s, in the second wave of feminism. So it's kind of part of our DNA, I'm afraid. I hope we can change that.
Me too.
Yes.
Thank you. unfortunately, history is always more complicated. If I remember correctly, even though Frederick Douglass originally was for women's rights and throughout his life was basically for the vote, during the time of the 15th Amendment, as an unfortunate and necessary compromise, he backed off from the sex was originally in that clause, and it was taken out. He regretfully took it out for political
you're very right. So that's where
it's so unfortunate that circumstances requires those kinds of compromises that can take eons to justify, eons to rectify.
You're very right. In fact, that's where the title of my book comes from, because after the Civil War and after the 14th and 15th Amendments, the women who we think of as the foremothers, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, are abolitionists. That's where they begin. They are abolitionists. They come to suffrage through that sense of universal equality. So they are suffragists, and they work for the 13th Amendment. They work to push Lincoln to have the Emancipation Proclamation. They really are strong universal suffragists, as is Frederick Douglass. After the war, they are angry and disappointed to find that for political reasons, the Congress says, oh, no, the nation can't handle two big reforms at once. Can't have black men get the vote and black women and white women. We can't handle that. So they're told the woman's hour is not now. The woman's hour has to wait. And Frederick Douglass, and I think it hurts him to have to say this too, but there's this very poignant speech that's in the book where he says, this is a matter for us of life and death. We are being chased and lynched and killed. We need the vote to protect ourselves. So the women's hour, he says, I promise you the women's hour will come, but it is not now. And so it's not till 1916 when Carrie Catt resumes her presidency of the association, and she gets up and she announces to the suffragists, the women's hour has struck. It's our time now. So that's where the title of the book comes from that compromise and from that. And that's a very bitter episode in the whole history after the 15th Amendment, where basically some suffragists decide they won't support it. If women can't be enfranchised with black men, they won't support it. And it's very ugly. There's vile language used, things you wouldn't expect Susan B. Anthony to say. And it's healed. I mean, it's healed in terms of their friendship with Frederick Douglass. In fact, I encourage all of you to go to Frederick Douglass House in Cedar Knoll, is it called? In Anacostia. And it's really a lovely place to visit. And if you go to his study, there are portraits on the wall. Supposedly it is as he left it, because he died coming back from a women's rights meeting. And it's Susan B. Anthony who goes directly to his house to sit with his wife in mourning. And if you go to his study, there's a portrait of Abraham Lincoln and a portrait of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So that personal relationship was healed. But between the movements, there's a tension, and that comes out here in the book. All right. Thank you.